Hey guys, it's Natalie and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I'm going to be doing my January wrap-up and talking about all of the books that I read over the course of January of 2020. It's the first month of the year. I had a really great reading month and I felt so motivated to read and to read all the new books that I got for Christmas and everything like that. So I managed to read a total of 20 books in January, which is absolutely insane. And I didn't think I'd be able to read so many, but I did. And I have 20 books to talk about. So let's get straight into those books. Please ignore the fact that two of my nails literally snapped off while I was at work. I'm a seamstress and I was sewing and two of my nails snapped off. So we're just gonna ignore that. I don't have time to go back to the salon currently, so I'm just gonna have to let them snap off until I can go back and get them done again. So, you know, just ignore that. It's fine. So the first book I read in January of 2020 is Far From the Tree by Robin Benway, and this is a contemporary that follows our three main characters, Joaquin, Grace, and Maya, who all share the same birth mother but were raised in very different households in the foster care system. And I absolutely loved this book. I gave it 5 stars. I think this has so many great relationships and friendships and hardship, and it deals a lot with found family, and I just loved everything about this book. I think it was written really well and the characters were very fleshed out and very realistic, and I really enjoyed that about it. And I know what it's like to have a lot of siblings, and when all of the siblings in this book come together, I completely understood the trials and tribulations of siblinghood because I have 8 siblings. So I completely understood everything in this book and I just absolutely loved it, and I think that it was written really well. Like I said, the characters are very fleshed out and well developed, and I really enjoyed the audiobook. I think it was really well narrated, so if you're looking for a great audiobook, then I highly recommend this one. I think this book would be great for fans of the TV show The Fosters because it has a lot to do with the foster care system and relationships and navigating them and everything like that. So yeah, my first book of January 2020 started off great. It was a 5-star book and I highly recommend this one. So the next book I read in January of 2020 is Amal Unbound by Ayesha Saeed, and this is a middle grade book that follows our main character Amal, who lives in Pakistan, and one day she says the wrong thing to the wrong person and ends up being forced into indentured servitude, working without pay for a very corrupt family in Pakistan. And I really loved this book. I gave it a 5-star rating. I think this has very important topics that aren't really touched on in many books, let alone middle grade books. Personally, when I was in school, I didn't learn a lot about indentured servitude, and I think this book is a very important window into indentured servitude. And I also really loved the infusions of Pakistani culture in this book, and I think this book is overall very impactful, informative, heartwarming, and I loved everything about it. It's definitely one of the best middle grade books I've read so far, and I actually talked about this in my middle grade book recommendations video, which I will link down below if you are interested. But yeah, I absolutely loved this book. It has a gorgeous cover, a really great message, it's very informative, and the audiobook is also narrated really well, and it's very short just like the book. So if you're looking for a good short audiobook, then I highly recommend this one. So the next book I read in January of 2020 is Carry On by Rainbow Rowell, and I read this book in high school after reading Fangirl by Rainbow Rowell, and I just didn't really remember anything about it, so I decided to read it again. And I listened to this half on audio and I read half of it physically. I was kind of bouncing between the two, but ultimately I ended up listening to the audiobook because the audiobooks are narrated really well, and I really enjoyed listening to them. And I think they're a little bit better than just reading the book physically because it is a little bit of a chunker and it is a little bit slow to start, but I think the audiobook definitely makes up for that. So this book basically follows our main character Simon Snow, and he goes to a prestigious boarding school for magicians called Watford, and basically he's been rooming with Baz forever, and they are sworn enemies and they hate each other. And one day Baz just does not show up to school, and it's like the 8th year that they've been going to school together and Baz just doesn't show up. So Simon basically is very confused and he's very curious as to where Baz went, and they end up in a relationship. And I absolutely loved this book. It has magicians, vampires, dragons, gays. I love it. This book was just so fantastic, and I'm so happy that I decided to reread it. And the audiobook, like I said, is narrated so well, and I just loved all the paranormal elements, all the friendships, all the relationships, and everything about this book just really made my ice cold heart warm a little bit and melt, and I just love this book so much, and I cannot wait to read it again. So the next book I read in January is, surprise surprise, Wayward Son by Rainbow Rowell, which is the sequel to Carry On by Rainbow Rowell. And I listened to this one on audio, and this book basically follows after the events of the first book, and it kind of ends up with Baz and Simon going on a road trip across America, which I thought was a really cool, fun idea. And basically this kind of just follows what it's like for a hero after they hit their peak in life, and kind of the mundanity of relationships and things like that, which I really appreciate seeing in a book, but it's not something I necessarily want to read. And I don't know, I just feel like Baz and Simon definitely need some couples therapy, and I was really sad to see their relationship in this book, but that's all I'm really going to say about it. I still love both of them to death. I still love Baz to death. He wears floral suits in this book, and he's just overall amazing, and I love him. But yeah, this book just didn't really do it for me. It wasn't as great as the first book. The first book, I feel like Rainbow Rowell put so much time and care into fleshing out the characters and characterization and everything like that. But in the second book, all of that just kind of crumbles, and I just feel like I wasn't sure what everyone's motives were in this book, when in the first book I knew exactly what everyone was doing and why they were doing it, but in the second book I just didn't really feel that as much. So maybe this is just kind of like the filler book for the end of the series, and I don't know. Some people loved this book, some people hated it. I'm kind of like in between. I gave it 3.5 out of 5 stars. I didn't hate it, and I don't think it's the worst book I've ever read, but I just think that it kind of pales in comparison to the first one in terms of plot and characterization. But other than that, I love the series still, and I'm still going to continue on with it. I just think that this book was a missed opportunity. So the next book I read in January is Amulet Vol.2 by Kazuki Buishi. This is the Stonekeeper's Curse, and this is a middle grade YA graphic novel series that I've been reading, and I read the second one in January, and I absolutely loved it, just like the first one, and I gave it 5 stars. So basically this follows our two main characters, Emily and Navin, who experience a family tragedy, then move to a house with their mother that has been in their family for generations, and one night their mother hears something in the basement. She goes down to investigate, and she gets taken by a really creepy tentacle monster. And so Emily and Navin are tasked with finding her, and there's kind of like a portal fantasy vibe to this book, and they basically just go down a rabbit hole from there, and they're transported to another world with all sorts of different creatures and characters, and I just love the series so much. It has a lot of friendship and family relationships and prophecy and magic and paranormal stuff, and I just really love the series. It's so much fun to read, and I just absolutely love the art style. I think it is so pretty and so cool, and I just can't say enough good things about it. So if you're looking for a really fun graphic novel series, then I highly recommend Amulet by Kazuki Buishi. So the next book I read in January is The Chaos of Standing Still by Jessica Brody, and this is a hard-hitting contemporary / romance that follows our main character Rin, who gets stuck at an airport during a blizzard, and she's kind of left to her own devices, and she's still very beside herself with grief over the loss of her best friend Lottie, until she meets Xander, who has problems of his own, and they kind of end up striking up a friendship and eventually a relationship. I actually really enjoyed this book, and I think this was one of the best depictions of grief that I've ever seen, and it's just so raw and realistic, and the author really doesn't tiptoe around anything or sugarcoat anything about what grief can be like to the point of destroying a person. I really liked how there were flashbacks in the book of Lottie and Rin's relationship, so you can kind of see how and why this grief is so hard for Rin, because you kind of understand how close they were and it makes you feel for her even more. I also really enjoyed the romance. I think it was very sweet and very pure, and normally I am not one to gravitate towards anything that is remotely considered insta-love, but this book, although it is kind of insta-love, it was done in a very tentative and emotionally attentive way, and they just didn't let the relationship progress unless both of them were comfortable with it, and Xander understood that Rin was going through a really hard time with grief, and so he was very gentle with her about that and very understanding, and he didn't like push anything onto her, and he didn't like throw himself at her, which I really enjoyed. And like I said, the relationship was just very tentative and I just loved it, and I think that he was a very nice love interest. He was very sweet and dorky, and I loved that. So I think this is the only case in my reading history where I've ever genuinely enjoyed a insta-love romance. So I think that's saying a lot about this book and how it was written. I really enjoyed the writing, and the audiobook is also narrated really well, and I was moved to tears while I was listening to this at work. So yeah, I highly recommend this one. It's a really good one. I gave it 4.5 out of 5 stars, and it's definitely one of my favorite contemporaries that I've ever read. The next book I read in January is The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald, and this is a classic that I read in high school, but I didn't remember too much about it, so I decided to reread it. And for some reason, when I think of New Year's, I think of the 20s for some reason, so I wanted to read a book that takes place in the 20s, and The Great Gatsby just fit that bill exactly. So this follows a group of characters in New York who are very rich, and they all have very complicated relationships with one another, and they have affairs, and they do things for revenge, and I just really loved this book. I know I didn't really explain that very well, but it basically follows our main character, Nick, who is the neighbor of Gatsby, who is a very rich man who throws these giant lavish parties in hopes that one girl will show up. And so the girl is Daisy, and she is married to a man named Tom. And basically back in the day, Gatsby and Daisy didn't work out because Gatsby was poor at the time, and so she decided not to marry him. So basically Gatsby just throws these giant parties in hopes that she'll show up one day and fall in love with him. So this book is basically about how rich people are absolutely disgusting because of money, and how they're very selfish and they let their desires drive them completely without any repercussions or anything like that, or consequences. And I just really loved this book. It's definitely like catty suburban drama of the 20s, and I just absolutely love that about it. All of the characters in this book were just very flawed and had their own quirks, and they all kind of meshed together in different ways, and all the relationships within that group were very complicated and different for each person. Some of them had beef, some of them didn't, and it was just really fun to read. And at the center of it all is Gatsby and Daisy, who are basically the cataclysmic glue that hold together but also tear apart their friend group, and it's just a pleasure to read. The plot definitely isn't the strong point of this book. It is the relationships between all these catty rich people. And our main character, Nick, is very stoic and indifferent, which I think creates a very unbiased standpoint for the reader, which I really enjoyed. And it's just a glimpse into what rich people do in the 20s, who are very dramatic for no reason. And I just love this book. It's so iconic. I will always love it. I gave it 5 stars, and it's definitely one of my favorite classics ever. So the next book I read in January is Paper Towns by John Green, and this one follows our main character, Quentin, and he kind of has been neighbors with this girl named Margot forever, and they've been kind of friends but kind of not friends forever. And one night Margot comes to Quentin's window and whisks him away on this adventure across Orlando. And then one night Margot disappears and nobody knows where she went, and her family is saying that it's a normal occurrence for Margot to disappear and that she'll come back. but Quentin doesn't think she's going to. So this kind of follows Quentin's journey on finding Margot and finding out why she left and all the little clues that she left him before she left. And yeah, so I was really set up to like this book because A, I normally like John Green's books, B, this takes place in Orlando, Florida, which is only an hour from where I live, and C, because it's a mystery and I love mysteries. So this book just fell flat for me because I feel like this is a cousin to Looking for Alaska, and all of the characters are exactly the same personality and everything as the characters in Looking for Alaska, just with different names. And this kind of just felt like it was trying to recreate a one-hit wonder. Personally, that's just how I felt about it. I'm also realizing I don't really love John Green's writing, and I think that his very cynical and arrogant writing style, like his voice as a writer, just doesn't sit well with me. I don't know if that's just because I'm not a teenager anymore, or if, I don't know, I just maybe just don't like his writing style. So yeah, I just found the gaggle of characters to be incredibly similar to that of Looking for Alaska, just with different names and a slightly different storyline. And I don't know, I just really did not enjoy this. I also did not like the writing style. I also don't like John Green's flippant use of the R word, which I think is incredibly inappropriate, and I don't know why in every book he writes that he has to just toss that word around like it's acceptable, which it's not. I get that this book was written in a different decade and it was more socially acceptable then, but it's not now, and it is considered very harmful, and I just really didn't like that about it. The stereotypes in this book were also laid on very thick, and I kind of found it to follow the trope of like a stoic artsy boy and a girl who is not like other girls because she doesn't like makeup and she likes literature and music. So I don't know, I just found this book to be not good, and I gave it 3 stars, and I am actually going to be getting rid of this copy, unfortunately. I just don't think I'm ever going to read it again. I listened to this on audio, and the audiobook wasn't objectively bad or anything. I think it was actually narrated pretty well. I just didn't like the book itself. So the next book I read in January is Love from A to Z by S.K. Ali, that follows our 2 main characters, Adam and Zainab, and they both have the same journal called Marvels and Oddities, where they write down marvels of their day or the oddities of their day. And obviously this is unbeknownst to the 2 characters that they share the same journal. And basically this follows Zainab and Adam, as Zainab, basically she stood up to her very racist teacher, and her mother decides to send her to stay with her aunt in Qatar for a couple of weeks. So Adam is dealing with multiple sclerosis, and he dropped out of school and is now living back at home in Qatar. And basically this kind of just follows Zainab and Adam meeting and falling in love. So I gave this book 5 stars. I absolutely loved it. I loved the romance so much. It was so sweet and so pure. It had multiple sclerosis rep, and I think this has a lot to do with racism and Islamophobia and POC identity and what being a Muslim means to each of the characters. And I just absolutely loved this book. It was the perfect balance of romance and hardship and culture, and I just loved everything about this book. And the audiobook was also narrated really well, and I was just absolutely head over heels for this book. So if you're looking for a really fun but also culture filled and important romance book, then I highly recommend this one. I loved it so much. The next book I read is The Warden's Daughter by Jerry Spinelli, and this is a middle grade book that follows our main character Cammie, who lives in a prison with her dad, and I think this takes place in the 1950s, 1960s, and she basically lives in the prison with her father, and he's the warden, and she lost her mother when she was an infant, and so she kind of looks to the female inmates as motherly figures. So this book deals a lot with grief and how that can affect a child, and kind of just a story of growing up and everything like that. So I enjoyed this book. I didn't love it, but I didn't hate it either. So I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. And I think that this book just could have been done a little bit better. And I just didn't love this one as much as I love some of Jerry Spinelli's other books, like Stargirl or Love Stargirl or Maniac McGee or anything like that. I just feel like this one was very underdeveloped in terms of characters and plot and everything like that. Our main character, Cammy, is incredibly bratty and rude and disrespectful, and she kind of uses the fact that her mother died when she was an infant against everyone around her, and basically just takes it out on everyone else, including her dad, and he basically lets her do whatever she wants, seemingly out of guilt, and I just don't think that's a really great parenting method right there. Like, there's no way that her dad just gave her the keys to the prison's exercise yard to talk to the inmates. Like, I don't think so, honey. Cammy's best friend Reggie was also a horrible person and basically just used Cammy for whatever she wanted, and Cammy just kind of like let her walk all over her. And so overall, the characterization in this book was really just not good. And I don't like how a friendship like Cammy and Reggie's is basically written as normal, because I don't think all girls are mean to each other like that all the time. There was also a character in this book called Boo Boo, who was a plus-sized black inmate, and she was written incredibly horrible, and it was just so stereotypical that it made me want to gouge my eyeballs out, and it was just awful. There just wasn't a strong plot in this book either, and there wasn't great character development, so this book kind of just hit like a negative equilibrium for me, and the book just became stagnant for me. Overall, I think this was like an okay coming-of-age story about a girl who is struggling with grief and everything like that. But I just feel like the writing could have done a little bit better. Like, there could have been a more interesting plot. There could have been better characterization, especially for the people of color in this book, which was extremely stereotypical and harmful. And I just think that he could have done better in writing diverse characters. So overall, I gave it 3 stars. I just don't think I'm ever going to read this again, and I really didn't like the audiobook either. So yeah. The next book I read in January is A Heart So Fierce and Broken by Bridget Kemmerer, and this is the sequel to A Curse So Dark and Lonely. And I can't tell you what this is about because that would spoil it, so I'll tell you the general synopsis of the first book, which follows our main character Harper, who gets whisked away into the magical kingdom of Emberfall, and basically Prince Ren and his royal commander Grey are trapped in a curse by a powerful enchantress, and they are doomed to relive the same season of autumn over and over again until the curse is broken by true love. So if you can't already tell, it is a Beauty and the Beast retelling, but instead of being a standalone book like most retellings, this one is a trilogy, and this is the second book that just came out in January, and I absolutely loved it. I loved it even more than the first book. I gave the first book 4.5 out of 5 stars, and I gave the second book 5 stars, because I feel like the foundation was already laid out and I already knew the characters so well that this book was just so much easier to get into. And this one was very different from the first one because the first one was just a lot of like world building and character development, whereas this book is basically exploring that world more and the politics that encompass it and everything like that. So overall, I just really enjoyed this book, and I loved every page of it. I love all the new characters. I love that Grey was getting even more character development in this book, and I just love everything about it. The plot, the magic system, I just love everything about it. So if you're looking for a great fantasy series, then I highly recommend the Cursebreakers trilogy by Bridget Kemmerer. So the next book I read is Scars Like Wings by Erin Stewart, and this book was kindly gifted to me by my friend Bree for Christmas. So Bree, if you're watching this, hi, I love you, what's up? So this book has actually been on my radar for a while. It got released in October of 2019, and it was in my October 2019 releases video, and I finally got around to reading it, and I absolutely loved it. So this book follows our main character, Ava Lee, whose family was in a very tragic fire and she lost everyone in her family and she was the only survivor. And she also has, I believe, 60% of burns covering her entire body. And it kind of just follows Ava trying to come to terms with her new life and kind of navigating her relationships with people that she's had before or new ones that she's forged. And I just absolutely loved this book. I've never read a book where a character is a burn victim, so I think this was a very unique perspective that was definitely very informative to read about. I loved all the characters and I think that they were developed really well. I really liked Ava as a character because even though she was very pessimistic and very realistic about what her life was like now that she's a burn victim, I think that she's very strong and very hard-headed, and she knows exactly what she wants out of any given situation. I also really liked her relationship with Piper, and I think that together they are both very strong and badass, and they are not going to let their bodies define them. I think the writing of this was very practical, and Ava's voice is just so witty and funny despite, you know, everything that's been happening to her. And I think this is just a very deep and raw exploration of grief and navigating relationships and friendships, and I just loved everything about this. This book didn't romanticize or dramatize absolutely anything or sugarcoat anything, and I think that's very important and necessary, especially for a book that deals with such a heavy topic. And I don't know, I just loved everything about this book. It was amazing. The audiobook was narrated so well and I just loved it so much, and I highly recommend it. 5 out of 5 stars. So the next thing I read in January is Saga Vol.1 by Brian K. Vaughan and Fiona Staples, and this is an adult sci-fi graphic novel series that follows our two main characters, Alana and Marco, who are basically being chased by the entire galaxy. So there is a moon and the planet that it orbits, and they are both at war, and Marco is from the moon that orbits Alana's planet, and so their planet and moon are at war, and basically they fall in love and they have a baby, and that's basically incredibly frowned upon because people who live on the moon are basically seen as like stupid and inferior and like monsters. And like I said, they're at war, and Marco was Alana's prisoner, and like I said, they end up falling in love, having a baby, and basically they're on the run from the entire galaxy. So I absolutely love this graphic novel series. I've had this on my TBR for a while, and I've actually seen Books with Chloe talk about it a lot, and I'll actually link her channel down below if you're interested. I love her videos. But I saw this copy at my library on sale for like $3, so I decided to pick it up, and I absolutely loved it. I really enjoy the art style of this, and I really like the plot of it, and this just has a bunch of like wacky, creepy characters in it, and I just really loved it. This is definitely for adults though. It has a lot of trigger warnings. There's murder and nudity and like sexual slavery and stuff like that, so if you don't want to read any of that, or if you're a young reader, then please don't read this. I will link my Goodreads down below where you can see the trigger warnings for any book that I talk about in this video, including this one. So yeah, this is definitely for adults, not for young readers. So the next thing I read in January is Stay Sweet by Siobhan Vivian, and this is a very fluffy and sweet contemporary book that follows a group of girls who work at an ice cream stand every summer, and our main character one day goes to basically set up the shop for the summer and finds the owner of the ice cream store dead on the floor. So basically the girls are convinced that the ice cream shop is going to be closed forever until the, I believe, grandson of the owner of the ice cream shop steps into the picture, and he is a business major, so he wants to take over the business. So the girls are basically trying to do their job while also being managed by a man, which only girls have ever worked at the ice cream shop, so they're very wary of having a man as a boss. So this book, let's talk about it. So I DNF'd this book at 80%. I was listening to this on audio and I decided to DNF it. I had a couple of reasons why I didn't like this book. The first one being the romance in this book. So basically our main character ends up falling in love with the grandson of the owner. And in doing so, she completely shuts out everyone else in her life, and our love interest, the owner's grandson, is basically a frat boy described as wearing polos, chains, and boat shoes. Which is not entirely horrible in itself, but also the fact that he has a horrible personality and is just overall a misogynistic douchebag really doesn't help propel the story. The next issue I had was with our main character, Amelia, who at first is seemingly very fun and sweet and outgoing, but turns out to be a complete doormat of a human being. So Amelia has literally no personality, no personal goals, no motivations. She is just an empty vessel of a human being who lets everyone else around her in her life control her and dictate her actions. So basically our love interest, I completely forgot what his name is and I honestly don't care, and Amelia's best friend Kate both basically play hot potato with Amelia and kind of just exploit her to do whatever they feel fit. Kate is a horrible human being, a horrible toxic friend who basically just makes Amelia do whatever she wants and gets upset when Amelia does something that Kate doesn't feel like she should do. I've had toxic friends like Kate before, and just reading about it made me sick to my stomach, and the fact that it is portrayed as a normal friendship really just makes my stomach hurt. Our love interest, he also had a lot of daddy issues, and he just wanted to please his dad no matter what, which made him a foot-kissing douchebag who is misogynistic as hell. I think the only thing that I really enjoyed about this book was the small town setting and just the fun summer vibes and the fact that they worked at this cute little all-girls ice cream store. Like, I liked the ice cream store and I liked everything that went into it and all of the plot lines that encompassed it, but everything outside of that, like the romance and the friendships, was all just catty suburban drama that I just did not care about, and it ultimately took away from the plot. The relationships in this book are just overall horrible, and the plot is really dry, and it just feels like a missed opportunity for a fun, fluffy summer contemporary that just ended up being a book about toxic friendships, toxic relationships, a doormat of a human being who lets everyone around her manipulate her, and I just really didn't like it. So I DNF'd it at 80% like I said, and when I logged it on Goodreads, I put it as having 1 star because that's just honestly how I feel about it. Another thing I wanted to say really quickly is that this book is pitched as feminist, and it is not at all. And the only thing that's feminist is the fact that the ice cream shop had only girl employees. But other than that, just the friendships and relationships and dynamics in this book were not feminist at all. And I'm not someone who's going to say like, this isn't feminist enough or this is too feminist. But here in this book, I just noticed a lack thereof. And that's just my own opinion. So yeah. The next book I read is The Wives by Taryn Fisher, and this is a thriller that follows our main character whose husband has 2 other wives, and she gets increasingly more curious about who these other 2 women are and who her husband truly is. So I gave this book 4 stars. I thought this was a very unputdownable, very fun domestic thriller. I really liked how our main character was an unreliable narrator and how everybody in this book had their own sets of flaws, and I found that to make them very realistic. To me, this book is kind of like a spool of thread just slowly being unraveled, and I really liked that about it. This was a very like slow burn thriller, and I just really enjoyed this. It had a lot of like psychological aspects to it, and I think it's one of my favorite thrillers that I read so far, so yeah. So the next book I read in January is Orpheus Girl by Bryn Rebel Henry, and this one I actually was really excited for its release, and it came out in October of 2019, and it was in my October book releases video, and I absolutely loved this book. So this follows our 2 main characters, Raya and Sarah, who are best friends who end up falling in love, and they live in a very conservative Texas town, and they end up getting sent to conversion therapy camp. I just absolutely loved this book. I gave it 5 stars. I think this book isn't really plot driven as it is an ode to conversion therapy camp and like how that can destroy people and how awful it truly is. I cried pretty much the entire time that I was reading this book, and it just hurt me so much to read about queer people going through basically a queer's worst nightmare. This is a very loose retelling of Orpheus and Persephone, and it's basically our main character Rhea, who is Orpheus, and she's going to the underworld to get Sarah, who is Persephone. I absolutely loved this book so much, and it floored me. I loved it so much. I was crying the entire time while I was reading it. I felt so much for the characters, and I just was so heartbroken by this book. I promised myself that when I talked about this book I wasn't going to cry, but I'm starting to like tear up a little bit. So I really loved this book because I think that the main character was so relatable to me. I felt like this book was written just for me, and it was so refreshing to see a main character who is so much like me and who goes through the same struggles that I did, and she doesn't have her mother in the picture, and I don't either, and just the fact that she had to hide in the closet all throughout high school, like, it just, Rhea was me, and I just felt so seen and heard, and I just loved this book so much. Okay, I'm sorry, I told myself I wasn't going to cry when I talked about this book. But anyways, I absolutely loved this book. I gave it 5 stars. It's definitely one of the best books I've ever read, and just the fact that there is so much like representation and visibility in this book, just, I loved it. And this is definitely one of the best LGBT books I've ever read, and I think that everyone should read this. Okay, now that we're done crying, the next book I read in January is Woven in Moonlight by Isabel Ibanez, and this is a Bolivian-inspired fantasy book that follows our main character, Ximena, who is the stand-in condesa, or queen, of the land of Inca Sisa. And so basically, Ximena and her people were drove out of La Ciudad by the evil usurper Atok, and she's basically trying to get the throne back for the real condesa, or the real queen, and it kind of just follows the story from there. I absolutely loved this book. I gave it 5 stars. I pre-ordered this before its release, and I just knew I was going to love it. Like, I don't know why, I just felt like I was gonna love it, so I pre-ordered it, and I got it the day it was released, and I loved it. All of the characters in this book are just so well developed and badass and motivated, and they all have their own reasons for doing things, and I loved the romance in this book, and I loved the magic system, and our main character Ximena can weave thread from moonlight, and I just thought that was a really cool magic system, and I just loved everything about this. This book is based on real Bolivian politics and culture, and I think that's very apparent, and I've never read anything with a Bolivian character or Bolivian inspired settings or anything like that, and I just think this book was a beautiful, very raw, very amazing infusion of culture and fantasy and romance, and I just loved everything about this. So if you're looking for a great fantasy book, then I highly recommend Woven in Moonlight by Isabel Ibanez. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. So I promise we only have a couple more books to talk about. So the next book I read was Broken Things by Lauren Oliver, and I actually pulled this one out of my TBR jar, and that's why I read it. And this one follows 3 girls who basically got obsessed with this book about 3 girls who went into the woods and like went into a different world, and so basically these 3 girls get obsessed with that book, and they end up being accused of killing their best friend, and they didn't actually kill her, but everybody in the town thinks that they killed her. And so it's basically just about this mystery and finding out who really killed their best friend Summer, and kind of them reconnecting and everything like that. That was probably like the worst synopsis I've ever given, but that's all I can really say without giving away too much. But basically, I gave this book 3 out of 5 stars because, like with Lauren Oliver's other book that I read, Before I Fall, I found it to be really mediocre in terms of characterization and plot and writing and everything like that. And I just came to the conclusion that either Lauren Oliver's writing style isn't for me, or it's like too juvenile, or a combination of both really. I just don't really click with her work, I've noticed, and I don't think I'm going to be reading anything else by her. But that's just my personal opinion. A lot of people love Lauren Oliver, and she's a very, very popular YA contemporary author. I just don't really click with her work. And I just, like I said, I found this to be pretty mediocre, just like the other book I read by her, Before I Fall. And I also feel like her books are unnecessarily long, and I feel like she could have gotten the point across a little bit faster than she did. But overall, yeah, like I said, I gave it 3 stars. I didn't love it, but I didn't hate it either. I think this one was slightly better than Before I Fall, and I think these were actually written like 8 or 9 years apart or something like that, so you can definitely see how her writing has improved, and I liked this one a little bit better. But overall, I just don't think I'm going to read it again, and ultimately I didn't take away anything from it. So the next book I read is When Dimple Met Rishi by Sandhya Menon, and this is a YA contemporary love story that follows our 2 main characters, Dimple and Rishi, and both of their parents want them to be in an arranged marriage. But Dimple very much wants to focus on her career. She just recently graduated, and she wants to go to college and get a degree in web development, and she is not concerned with getting married or having a husband at all, which is totally understandable. So basically, Dimple goes to this convention slash competition for web development over the course of a couple of weeks, and basically Rishi's parents find out about it, and they send Rishi to basically woo Dimple into marriage. And the arrangement is very unbeknownst to Dimple, and when they meet for the first time, she like throws a coffee on him, and she's like, "Who the heck are you? Why are you saying that we're gonna be husband and wife? I don't know you." And so it starts out on a really hilarious note. I really loved this book. I gave it 4.5 out of 5 stars. I think this was a very sweet romance. I really liked the love interest. I liked both the characters, really. I think that they were both very well developed, and I think that the relationship was also really great because it evolved slowly, and there was a lot of great discussions about sex and consent and everything like that, and I just loved everything about it. There is also tons of culture in this book because both Dimple and Rishi are both Indian, and I just absolutely loved this book so much. Like, so much culture and friendship and relationships, well fleshed out characters, an interesting plot. I just loved everything about it, and I highly recommend it. So the next and last book that I read in January of 2020 is The Poet X by Elizabeth Acevedo, and this follows our main character Xiomara, who lives with her family in Harlem, and her family is very, very religious and traditional, and Xiomara is not. Xiomara writes poetry as an outlet, and she writes about everything in her life, including her strained relationship with her mother and the relationships that she's in and everything like that. And basically, her mother does not approve of this at all, and it is very unbecoming of Xiomara, and she also asks questions at church, which is very frowned upon. And overall, her relationship with her mother is kind of like the core of this book. This book basically just follows Xiomara trying to live her own life and kind of wriggle out of her mother's expectations for her. And I just absolutely loved this book. I actually listened to this half on audio, half physically, and I loved the way the audiobook was narrated. It was narrated by Elizabeth Acevedo herself, and it was just so powerful. And this book is written in verse, and it's very poetic because it is basically, the whole book is basically poetry and what Xiomara is writing in her journal. And I just loved this book so much. It deals with so many important topics, and it deals a lot with like expectations and family relationships, and I just loved it so much. So overall, I loved this book. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. It is absolutely beautiful, and I just can't say enough good things about it. So I think that concludes my January wrap up. Thank you guys so much for watching. I know this video was kind of long, but like I said, I managed to read 20 books in January, so I had quite a few to get through, so thank you for bearing with me. Thank you guys so much for watching. Leave a like and subscribe down below, and hit the notification bell if you don't want to miss a single upload, and have a great day. Bye!